Welcome to this 3D printing for remote control video. This video is in direct response to a couple of subscribers that have asked some really great questions about what the printer is like to live with that we used in the series. If you remember, we actually started out and we've been using a Geeetech G2S Pro Rostock style printer, and I chose that one because it has a very small base for the printable height that I needed. Mine sits on the edge of the desk, as you can see here, and I just didn't have a lot of physical space. But I didn't want that to mean that I could only print a couple of inches X, Y and Z dimensions. Occasionally I do want to print things that are a little bit bigger. So that's why I went for this kind of printer, and we used it through the series, and now I've had it and been using it regularly pretty much every day or every other day every week for about the last 5 months. So this video is going to be talking about how this thing is to live with, because like all 3D printers, it has its own little quirks. It has some things that have been good, it has a couple of problems that we've had, but I've sorted them out. So I wanted to go through that for those of you that may be thinking about a Rostock style printer, or even specifically this one that we've looked at, reviewed and used in the series, so you kind of know what you're letting yourself in for. I do have to say that I am very impressed with the printer. The challenge with all these Rostock devices is drawing a straight line on an axis isn't like a printer that has dedicated X, Y and Z stepper motors moving things around. It does mean that for every part of the print, even for a straight line, it's having to move all the 3 motors at the same time. Now that can be evidenced as very slight variations in the way that it actually prints, and you don't get a completely smooth surface, but that's one of the prices that you pay even with a Rostock printer that's set up pretty spot on. So I'm going to now go through a couple of the modifications that I've made to this printer to make it more versatile and more useful for me. First thing I'll talk about is the fact that we've added a cover for the power switch. The power connections on this, as an electronics guy of old, do make my blood run cold, so I've enclosed some of it with a printable plastic shroud. I can make this available on Thingiverse if you want to kind of pop it in as well. It was just a way for me to keep as much of the wiring out of the way of both myself, but also if I have smaller family members visiting, that they always want to come and see the 3D printer working. It's one of the highlights of the trip. Then I don't have any little fingers catching live contacts. I've also added some LED lights to the side. One of the things that I found is, particularly when the 3D printer's running, I don't like to leave it unattended, but I do like to keep an eye on how the print's going. So for those instances, this little light at the side allows it to sit in its own pool of light, and I can just glance across in these dark evenings in the winter, and I can make sure that everything's all still running great. I have also added an additional 40mm fan. This is connected to the side by a couple of cable ties, and it has designed and printed a little 3D printable shroud that allows me to turn this fan on and off. It's actually wired into the 12-volt supply from the main power supply, and a little switch on the main umbilical cable just allows me to turn it on and off. Now this is something that this printer didn't have, but other printers do, and it allows me to print some really delicate pieces where occasionally, if the plastic isn't cooling down quickly enough as it comes out of the heated end, it can sag. So now for those really delicate prints for the really small quads, or these really small parts like this support for this little WS2812 clip, it means that those parts are printed beautifully. Other thing I've done is I've also designed and printed these carriage clips. Now there are occasions when I get so engrossed in something that I'm doing on the computer is that I forget to keep an eye on the print, or if I need to walk away briefly to get myself a cup of coffee or to use the toilet, that is the guaranteed time that the print will want to finish. So I've created these little carriage clips that clip onto all the vertical risers that capture the carriages at the top, so when it finishes the print and does the home, which brings it up to the top, that when the stepper motors disable themselves, then the whole assembly doesn't come crashing down on my newly printed part. I have had a couple of problems, so let me talk about the 3 main ones that I've done. First of all is we have had a bearing failure. One of the bearings at the very top that the belts run through. One of the bearings collapsed completely. That was causing some kind of weirdness to happen, inaccuracies in the print, and then I spotted it. It took me a second to spot because obviously this piece is kind of captured in a little clip itself, and it was only kind of watching it very carefully you could see that it was now wobbling around. I have made and designed and 3D printed a replacement part, and that is what is up there. So that was fine. I'm keeping an eye on the other sides. I've designed the replacement part to use slightly heavier duty bearings. It's actually bearings from a T-Rex 500 kit, which is a nice size remote control helicopter. So if the bearings can cope with remote control helicopter, they should cope with this application too. The other problem I had, I've only have one blockage in the time that I've had it. So to clear the blockage was really straightforward. All I did was I just retracted the plastic filament that I had and then pulled out the feeder tube at the top, preheated the end to just above where PLA was. So I actually went and preheated it to ABS, so I knew the PLA would be nice and soft. And then while it was still warm, I unscrewed the actual aperture at the end, a little brass piece, and then used a cocktail stick to push the blockage out of the top. Made sure that any other plastic in the actual hot end itself, that little brass bit, was taken care of, put it all back together, and it's been working fine ever since. The other thing they have to be a little bit careful with this is because all of the springs here that do the calibration are spring loaded, the vibration of printing does make the screws move ever so slightly. So I calibrate this little guy about once every 3 or 4 weeks, depending on how well I'm printing. It isn't a particularly difficult process. It's documented in the manual and we've gone through it in the video series, but once you have done it 2 or 3 times, it's kind of a 10-minute process and it gets your printer dialed spot on. I do not use the auto calibration feature on this model. I tend to like it set up mechanically perfectly, and then I can kind of avoid that every time I print. And if I suddenly start to see that the head is slightly tugging on the blue paper on the bed, or if I'm noticing when I take the print off that one side isn't as squished at the bottom, I know that it's time to calibrate it, and I just keep an eye on it as well. Last tip I'd give you is we originally started off using Slicer, and we use Slicer in the videos. I have since moved and are now using Cura, C-U-R-A, another free slicing bit of software, and I've had some better results with that, particularly around things like support material, where the support material in Cura is done a lot nicer in my opinion, and it's easier to remove. So just be aware of that. Cura has some other nice features too, where you can set a minimum time for each of the layers to print, and that can be handy when you're doing delicate stuff. It lets the previous layer of plastic cool down enough to support the next one that's coming along. So I would recommend, if you're going to use this printer, have a look at Cura. It took me a while to move on to it, and now it's the default slicer that I use for all of my models. So hopefully that helps those of you that are thinking about this printer, and particularly those subscribers who have asked me what it's been like to live with. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and happy flying.